Mr. Chairman, congratulations to both of the nominees. Judge Pan, nice to see you. I've received the nicest note and letter from former Attorney General and Judge Mukasey, who I see is sitting behind you. And Judge, good to see you again. Thank you, as ever, for your service. And Judge Pan, congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you.
Ms. Bloomekatz, can I just ask you a question, a follow-up question? Senator Booker was just talking about domestic violence, violence against women, and I want to follow up on that line of questioning. You represented Brandon Moore when you were in private practice, is that right?
Yes, Senator.
You remember that case?
Jones Day, the firm that I was at the time, had accepted his representation as part of their pro bono practice.
How did you come to represent him?
The public defender's office had a conflict in that case, and so they approached Jones Day and myself and several of the attorneys there about taking on the representation because they were conflicted out of that.
So you weren't appointed by a court, you volunteered to do it?
Right at the outset of the case, Senator, I know it's a bit confusing, but right at the outset of the case, it was taken on by Jones Day as part of its pro bono practice. Later on, I was indeed appointed by the 7th District Court of Appeals of Ohio to represent Mr. Moore.
Well, but when Jones, I'm just trying to figure out how you got involved. It sounds like when you were at Jones Day, you volunteered to work on the case. Is that right?
That's correct,
okay.
Senator.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Brandon Moore. And sadly, I need to warn folks in the audience and watching this that the details of this case are very unpleasant. I'm not going to read all of them. These are taken from the Ohio Supreme Court's factual recitation. If you want to read it for yourself, it's 149 Ohio State 3rd 557. So Brandon Moore, on the evening of August 21st, 2001, Youngstown, Ohio, he started that evening by robbing 2 people at gunpoint in their driveway. He fled the scene. He then went with a group of other individuals and hunted down a 21-year-old Youngstown University student, young woman, who was working the night shift at a group home for mentally handicapped women. Are you with me so far? Mr. Moore, your client then held this young woman at gunpoint, told her to give him all of her money and belongings. He and his accomplices then brutally attacked her, raped her multiple times. Mr. Moore kidnapped her, drove her away, followed by another member of his group, continued to sexually assault her while he did that. Mr. Moore and his companion drove down a dead-end street, forced this young woman out of the car. She was pregnant, by the way. Continued to violently rape her at gunpoint, then went through all of her belongings on her person. Finally, Mr. Moore ended by shoving a gun in her mouth. I'm not going to read all of his quotes, it's too graphic, but basically threatened her and said that he'd kill her if she or her family told anybody about the attack. She later said that attack killed a part of her. They killed a part of my soul. I'm quoting her, that I can never get back. He was sentenced to 141 years in prison. The trial court determined that he could not be rehabilitated. That's a quote. Mr. Moore could not be rehabilitated. It would be a waste of time and money and common sense to even try, end quote. You, however, argued all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court that he ought to be released early because his sentence was a violation of the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. And you also said at the end of the case to the press, I'm going to quote you now, kids are different. And any sentence for a non-homicide offense that denies them a second chance of life is unconstitutional. Kids are different. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around why you call this teenager who did the things I just described a kid and say that kids are different and he ought to be treated differently. Help me understand that. Why you chose to represent this individual. You have a lot of talent. You're highly educated. You're obviously extremely capable. You, by your own estimation, devoted hundreds of pro bono hours to representing Mr. Moore. Why are kids different? Why is this guy a kid? And why shouldn't he have served time for his horrific crimes, for what he did to that young woman?
Senator, there were horrific crimes in that case, and Despite the horrific crimes in that case, I do believe that everyone is entitled to defense and everyone's entitled to a constitutional sentence. And the United States Supreme Court, in the case Graham versus Florida, did say that kids are different. If they are under 18, they are treated differently under the Constitution. And it was my duty as Mr. Moore's advocate to argue that he receive a sentence that comported with the case in Graham.
Well, just to be clear, the Supreme Court didn't say kids are different. You said kids are different. That's not their quote. That's your quote. This was a case of first impression. Graham deals with a different set of facts. You argued to the Ohio Supreme Court it ought to be extended to people like Mr. Moore, and you succeeded. I mean, the Ohio Supreme Court took you up on it, and they said that the guy ought to be released. I just am surprised that this is how you choose to use your considerable talents and to argue for the extension of a Supreme Court case to an individual like this and to argue that he's somehow different. He's a criminal. He was 15 years old at the time he committed these horrific crimes, and what he took away from that young woman, she'll never get back. I just find that, I find it hard to understand. My time's expired. I know there are others who are going to want to ask questions, so I'll follow up with some more questions for the record. But thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Bloomekatz, do you have a response?
Senator, I would just say that it was my duty to represent Mr. Moore and to ask that he be given a constitutional sentence in compliance with Graham versus Florida.
Thank you very much. Senator, I believe, is